Recognize this, Eisenhorn.
Where is he? Where did your seal just not load in? I'm being interrogated by my own badge.
We're not afraid.
Look at these other two. They're just posing menacingly. Xenos is the first book in the Eisenhorn trilogy by Dan Abnett, and it's often touted as the best starting place for newcomers interested in the gargantuan universe of Warhammer 40,000. Eisenhorn Xenos, however, is an iOS game from 2016. Hey, why'd they make it a phone game? Anyway, despite being an iOS game, the quality of the PC version is fine. I didn't find there were any huge problems, and if I didn't know ahead of time that it was a mobile game, I honestly would not have been able to call that. It plays kind of more like a bad computer game, not like a bad port of a game. It isn't fun, it drags for no reason, and they completely botch certain parts of the book. And I kinda liked it anyway. I would even recommend it to some of you. Though, with a lot of caveats. The basic premise of the story goes like this. Inquisitor Eisenhorn and his team have been chasing down his heretical rival for years, a man named Iclone. Iclone, like a cyclone, but with eyes, because the warp, you know what, I don't need to explain this to you, you get it. Iclone is sort of like a fixer for cultists. He shows up to help cults and corrupt sorcerers work on their evil startups, and help out when things go wrong. Eisenhorn arrives on the planet of Hubris, which, due to the slow rotation of their planet, has their entire population, aside from a few custodians, asleep in cryotombs for months at a time to avoid the impossible cold. Eisenhorn finds that Iclone has arrived on Hubris to wake the ruling class up early, which seems like it might just be rude, but apparently it's also fatal, but it is still rude. Although Eisenhorn finally manages to bag Iclone on Hubris, Eisenhorn is left to question, why the hell did Iclone do this? Who was he working for? What was this sacrifice even meant to do? And these questions lead Eisenhorn down a long chain of suspects, mysteries, and schemes. It's a pretty unique detective story. Eisenhorn was there to stop something, but he has no idea what the hell he just stopped, or what else the villains have planned. Hi everyone, I'm William SRD, and I've recently started a journey to find and review the worst Dungeons & Dragons video games. And since my analytics tell me that at this point my audience is also super into Warhammer as well, I figured that maybe it would be fun to see if we can do the same thing with Warhammer 40k games. That's not a promise, this is a test run to see if you guys are interested in that kind of thing before I commit to it, but it would be pretty fun, I think, to play all the worst 40k games and conclusively decide which is the worst one. Anyway, if that's your thing, it would honestly help me a lot if you would hit the like button and considered subscribing to the channel, especially if you want to see more of my struggles through the deep, dark depths of D&D and 40k's worst adaptions. So that journey brought me here. A bad adaptation of a beloved book? Inexplicably chosen to be made as an iPhone game? Removed from Steam at the request of the creators? Bro, sign me up. And what I played was indeed an awful mess of a game, just like I was expecting. But on the other hand, it was a decent something else. We'll get to that. And in case you were worried, this video is going to be extremely light on spoilers, since you may still want to read the book. You should read the book. It's very good. And I also understand that there's an Eisenhorn TV show in production, so I don't really want to spoil the story for people who want to watch that either. The most natural place to start with most abandonware is to talk about how to get them up and running. And I'm happy to say that Eisenhorn didn't give me any trouble once I was able to get a copy. But therein lies the problem. It's no longer available on Steam Marketplace or the Android store. I also took a quick look on the Apple App Store on my brother's iPhone, and it doesn't seem to be available there either. The only place I found, however, where you could pick up a copy was through Humble Bundle. So that's where I got mine. The Pixel Hero team disappeared in 2016. All of their socials abruptly end with the announcement of the Android release of Eisenhorn. More was very clearly intended, since the Humble Bundle description includes includes a reference to planned DLC. This was a team with a lot of passion for the project. They even collaborated to create an Eisenhorn comic book to be sold with the game, though my copy did not include that. It's hard not to see their sudden departure as a bitter and somewhat shameful exit from a group of people who kinda just had their dream crushed. It's sad, really, because for all the passion and talent in the dev team, they were hampered by being way too ambitious with this project. And that overambition harmed virtually every facet of the game. This was a really small dev team, and they tried to make a game that was way too big for them. Anyway, after buying and installing it, how does it run? Well, for me, I gotta say, badly. In order to get a decent quality recording that wasn't chugging like mad, I had to knock the resolution all the way down to 720, and even then, I still had to reduce a ton of the effects and options. Annoyingly, the graphic options seem to layer a ton of effects behind the depth of field option, like film grain, and as far as I can tell, anti-aliasing. I had to disable this entire setting because it gave me back about 20 frames a second, and I really needed those frames. But the problem with anti-aliasing being locked in that setting is that Eisenhorn Xenos really needed the anti-aliasing. Everything in this game looks like it's constructed out of razor blades, and I feel like if I let Eisenhorn get too close to the edges, he's just gonna start bleeding. A review from launch actually compliments how well optimized this game was, and other reviews from around that time talk about running it on max. So yeah, the fact that it runs so badly, it might just be a me problem, or it might just not be playing well with 2022 tech. Performance problems aside, the graphics themselves are pretty good in my opinion. It's one of those scenarios where the quality of the graphics isn't always great, but the art direction elevates things. The environmental team in particular really did a phenomenal job adapting the locations from the book into 3D environments. It actually boggles my mind that a team this small managed to put this together. There were only 2 environment artists, and they put together so many of these environments, and they did such a great job, even if they're built from razor blades. The character models are fine too for the most part, but that's about all. There are a lot of characters who got unique models, which is great. However, the team's limited resources start to come into play now, because the assets for the actual enemies you're fighting all the time really do suffer from a lack of variety. However, the significance of having so many unique character models really can't be understated. Remember that this is a story in which Eisenhorn is really burning through a very long list of heretics on the way to figure out what the real problem is. So seeing this many villains represented with a decent 3D model is a very, very welcome touch.
It is an honor, my Lord Oberon.
For a grain merchant from Smater, it surely must be.
Uricel, commander of the House Militia and brother of Oberon, the current Lord Glor.
I don't know you, Rizal. I have met plenty of rich grain merchants.
Gorgon Locke, wealthy shipmaster.
But how many with such intriguing female company?
And Ecclesiarch Datso, representative of some missionary order from the sub-sector Edgeworld Damas, which House Glor was sponsoring.
Though there are certainly times when the modeling really does fail to live up to the descriptions in the book. The Carnodon was 6 meters from nose to whipping tail. 900 kilos of muscle, sinew, striped pelt, and sawing tusks. Oh, they just went with a big dog, okay. The exception for all of this is the character model for Gregor Eisenhorn, which looks significantly better from the rest, even if your settings are all on low. Honestly, every aspect of Eisenhorn's presentation works really, really well. He looks right, he's animated well, and his voice, well, I guess it's time to talk about the voices.
All my life, I have had a reputation for being cold, unfeeling. I am not. But I possess a singular force of will. To feel pain, fear, or grief is a luxury I cannot afford. Throughout my career it has served me well to steel myself against all that this wretched galaxy can throw at me.
The voice of Gregor Eisenhorn is so good in this game. You can almost be tricked into thinking that this is a good game from just how good Eisenhorn sounds. So this here is really the highlight of the entire game. They managed to get Mark Strong to voice Eisenhorn, and he's absolutely perfect. As I said, there seems to be a TV adaptation of Eisenhorn coming at some point, and I need to see Mark as the live-action Eisenhorn after playing this game. I don't care if he needs a wig and a weightlifting regimen, he's perfect. Cast him. Anyway, the voice of Eisenhorn sounds so good, and the game pulls monologue directly from Dan Abnett's prose, meaning that not only does Eisenhorn sound great, he's also saying the right things. But Eisenhorn isn't the only character.
Oh my god, my god! We've got to escape!
You're dead, you know, Gregor.
The other voice actors are mostly okay, but the problem is that they're very inconsistent. The same character will sound really good in one scene, but sound like they've never used words before in the next. To me, that sounds like it's more of a problem of voice direction instead of voice acting. It's hard to know exactly what went wrong, but there are even scenes when Mark Strong is talking very strangely. I don't see anyone credited as being the voice director for this project, so the consistency of the sound quality suffers a lot. So, with Eisenhorn both looking and sounding so much better than the rest of the game, there's this weird effect. It feels like you're playing as the protagonist of a much better game. It's like if you were playing a fully realized Gregor Eisenhorn, but in RuneScape.
Do you think me weak?
We might as well talk about the rest of the sound while we're on the topic. The music and sound stuff was done mostly by a third party, a company called Sweet Justice. Their music work was exemplary. The Eisenhorn soundtrack is really well done. It doesn't really break the mold like a few 40k titles do, but for the most part, the music of Xenos manages to sound exactly the way you would expect 40k music should sound. However, when it comes to the sound effects, we have a problem.
Get your men to lower their weapons, even the ones I can't see. Midas, train the wing cannons on myself and the chaser.
If you do play this game, I recommend you adjust your sound effects to about half of everything else, otherwise you're just gonna have a bad time. Well, honestly, when it comes to sound effects, you're going to have a bad time no matter what, because nearly every aspect of the sound design is incompetent, and it only manages to harm the final product. I can't overstate how the sound design manages to fail at every turn.
Don't blame me for anything except being too late to stop him. As I said, you have my sincere condolences.
You'll especially find that it fails during combat. Weapons just don't sound right. Chainswords and bolt pistols both have distinct ways that you would expect them to sound, and the game totally fails at both. The chainswords in this game sound a little bit like somebody just got punched in the face while someone else is running a weed whacker. Now, I understand that this is probably a matter of preference, but I want my chainswords to sound like they're ripping or tearing something up. I don't want there to be a thud. Meanwhile, bolt pistols are oversized hand cannons that fire exploding ammunition. The sound effect needs to be big, but instead we get this? They are not supposed to go pew pew. The final thing I want to talk about when it comes to presentation is the animation. I would actually mostly give compliments to this part of the game. The majority of the animations are smooth and well done. The kill moves are fairly few, but they feel really good, even if the sound design, as always, manages to let everything else down.
No!
That said, There were only 2 animators on this game, so much like with absolutely everything else, there are a lot of dud animations that don't look great. On a human side of things, I feel really bad for these animators because I think they clearly were worked to the bone and they did a great job considering, but the final effect is, well, it's not good enough. And it doesn't feel good on the user end of things, no matter how hard the animators worked or how talented they were. Honestly, Eisenhorn Xenos was way too big of a game for this team. So that feels like a pretty good segue to talk about the overall gameplay and game design, which is really the part where this game failed hard. Like before, some of the elements are okay and have actual real talent behind them, but spread way too thin. Let's start with combat. Combat is really quite simple. You can melee attack, ranged attack, dodge, and knock people over with psychic powers. Melee enemies are good at parrying your melee attacks, but both sorts of enemies are very good at dodging ranged attacks. So you're gonna have to wait until they're locked into an attack animation before you unload on them. Otherwise, you might just have to knock them over with your psychic blast before attacking. You also have a kind of slowdown mode where you can line up a series of attacks. I didn't find it incredibly useful, but it did have its moments. The system is very basic, but it didn't bother me all that much. For one thing, it's pretty solid combat actually for an iOS game, but more importantly, in a game adaptation of the Eisenhorn book, I don't really care about the combat. At the end of the day, this is a detective story on an overwhelming scale. The combat only needed to be passable, and it is passable here. There was a basic stealth system as well, and I would also call that passable. You can lead people around with psychic powers, blind them if you have certain companions, or hack into servo skulls to stop them from alerting guards. It was good to have, since the combat can really attrition down your health pool if you fight too many packs in a row. I don't really have any complaints about this. These systems were basic, but they were what they needed to be. Now comes the real issue: level design. The test for making an Eisenhorn game is how do you gamify all the non-combat elements? It's mostly a book about talking and investigating. So how did the video game adapt those things mechanically? It didn't. All of that is relegated to cutscenes. You spend all your time either fighting, playing minigames, or puzzle platforming. It's not the right gameplay for the story. And I think it was done this way because Pixel Hero's previous game, Spiral, appears to have been that sort of game as well. So they kinda just copy-pasted the gameplay they already knew how to make into the world of Eisenhorn, and it was not the right call. Even if they managed to design a few of those sections pretty well. Especially because the choice to make the game this way is really what led to the team being stretched so thin. A lot of moments in the book were just not suited for this style of gameplay, and the game just extends them so that you can puzzle platform for longer. So, no spoilers here, but there's a scene in the book that's very short. Eisenhorn and his team spot people breaking into a guest house he's staying in. So he and Betancourt get the drop on attackers and take them prisoner. It's a pretty quick scene, but in the video game, Eisenhorn jumps out of a window, goes on a big platforming section complete with noxious gases, timing his way past colossal burning vents, and then eventually returns to the front of the manor to have that same fight against the invaders. I'm not against that in principle, if the team had enough assets. But see, that's just the thing. They didn't have enough assets. They had enough people for a small and tight little game where they gamified the book. But they just kept adding levels that weren't in the book. Sometimes this works well. Turning the introduction with iClone into a level like this works great. And so does the infiltration of House Glaw. But you barely had enough hands on deck. So why are we turning travel sections that were brushed over in a paragraph in the books into hours-long platforming sections? Now, even then, if they had the assets, I just don't think that an action-adventure was the right way to go with this game. It's just a flawed premise. It's a dialogue-heavy story about factions and world-building. I would say the ideal Eisenhorn game is probably something closer to like Coder or any of the old BioWare games. And obviously, Pixel Hero didn't have those assets, so I'm not mad they didn't go that route. But there's another style of game that would have been almost as well suited and a much smaller job to make. If we got an Eisenhorn game that was more like a Telltale style narrative game where you make the choices, even if those choices are not the choices that Eisenhorn made in the book, I honestly think that would have worked way better. But as is, if action adventure was truly what they wanted to go for, they needed to be very efficient. But they chose instead to be extravagant and bite off way more than they could chew. And that is the one sole reason that this game is so bad. But I would still recommend it to a great many of you, because they did indeed gamify a very good book, even if it's poorly done and extended way farther than it had to be. It's pretty clumsy, but it doesn't miss all that much from the book. Plus, I mean, it's a really good visual aid to a lot of the scenes in the novel. Eisenhorn is a pretty interesting series, because Dan Abnett is an interesting writer. His prose can be very otherworldly, and sometimes a bit difficult. Warhammer 40,000 is a strange, grandiose setting, and the prose perfectly illustrates the texture of this universe. Dan Abnett is not writing in English. Dan Abnett is creating a somewhat challenging translation of Warhammer 40,000 from the original High Gothic. It's very cool to read, and it's very thematic, but it takes some getting used to. You really need to concentrate for the first few chapters until you're used to the writing style. And I love that, but it can be a really big ask for a lot of people. So if you've got like ADHD or dyslexia, man, this is gonna be a tough book for you. But now we have a game adaptation that covers the vast majority of the book events, but it is not a good replacement for the book. If you're not planning on reading Eisenhorn, do not play this game. If you have already read Eisenhorn, do not play this game. The people who should be playing this game are people who are reading Eisenhorn right now, because Eisenhorn Xenos is not a good video game, but it's a pretty decent study supplement for the book. I would really view this game as a great tool for people who are struggling with reading Xenos. And I hesitated. A merciful subscription would spare him everything, but I could not. The algorithm would not understand a mercy subscription. I would be trapped here for years watching his banger videos. I shook off his desperate call to action and moved on. Do you think me weak? Flawed? Do you hate me for setting my desire to watch more random videos above the needs of a small YouTuber? If you do, I commend you. But if you hate me, I know this about you. You are no casual YouTube viewer. You don't have the moral strength.